This week on the BackTable podcast.
We are in a absolutely privileged position to be physicians. We are in a situation where we get paid for a service very well, comparatively, and we are able to do work that is extremely validating and helps other individuals. You can get too much of a good thing, and you've got to watch out for it. The potential here is really fabulous. So not only in our profession, but also otolaryngology within our specialty is really fabulous. As long as you just don't find yourself in one of these pitfalls, approach it as you would just hitting singles and doubles. You will find that is plenty to do very well in your life and to be able to accomplish goals that are far beyond anything in healthcare or being a physician.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BackTable ENT podcast, where we discuss all things ENT. We bring you the best and the brightest in our field with a hope that you can take something from our show to your practice. Thank you for stopping by. My name is Ayesha Khalid, and I am an otolaryngologist at Cambridge Health Alliance in the Harvard Medical System in Boston, Massachusetts. And I am so excited to have here with me today Dr. Robert Puchalski on our BackTable podcast. Dr. Puchalski, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice, and then we will dive right in?
Sounds great, Ayesha. Thanks so much for having me on this podcast. It's very nice to be here. I am a private practice ENT doc who specializes in both sleep medicine and general ENT. I enjoy rhinology and allergy the most in the general side of the house. I practice in Columbia, South Carolina, the center of the state, and am part of South Carolina ENT, which is a practice that is 10 physicians with 9 sites in and around Columbia, South Carolina, and the Midlands of South Carolina. And I've been practicing for about 22 years. Started the practice coming right out of residency. And on the personal side, I'm married to a wonderful pediatric ER doc whose name is Amy. And we have 4 great kids, 3 of which are out of the house, and 1 is still hanging out as a rising 8th grader.
Awesome. I will take a moment to say this is such a pleasure to be doing this podcast, because what the listeners may not know but are about to find out is that Dr. Puchalski and I have known each other since I was a medical student. He was the senior and chief resident on one of my medical student rotations at Penn when I decided to go into otolaryngology. So it's pretty exciting to be here today.
That's right. That was quite some time ago, but great memory.
Right, for both of us. So we have so much to talk about today, but I thought it might be helpful, since we're trying to do a podcast, to really have our fellow ENT physicians understand and get an idea of what you've learned, both on the practice management side and on the personal side around financial literacy for otolaryngologists. And if you can maybe give us and discuss the top 5 lessons that you've learned along the way, as if you were at the end of your career, which I know you're far from. What would you impart to our younger generations? And we can go in any order that you like, but I think top 5 takeaways will be amazing.
Sure. So the first thing I'd probably share is my situation's unique because I came right out of residency and I started a practice. And so I have experience being a solo practitioner because it was a few years before I brought on a partner. And then when I brought on a partner, I had the experience of being in a 2-physician practice. And where this is going, it kept growing and growing up to 10 physicians. And so I have the unique experience of really being in a variety of different sizes of practice. And one of the things that I get asked quite frequently by residents or young otolaryngologists who are looking to get in and start practice are, along with the folks that are trying to declare themselves as whether or not they want to do academics or private practice, and then in private practice, what kind of silo they want to be in. they're wondering how big a practice they want to join. And so my experience now is only limited to private practice. We are now very thankfully affiliated with Senta, which is a private equity-backed platform, but we've never had a hospital affiliation, so I can't speak to that. But I, having the experience that I have, can impart this wisdom and knowledge that it is the size practice you join is very much a determinant of the day-to-day challenges and pleasures that you'll have in private practice. And I think that some folks are fit for different size practices. They just may not know it. And so first and foremost, folks who are really concerned about controlling their environment and making sure that things are the way that they want them and that they're very particular about the way they perform a procedure or see a patient should probably gravitate toward the smaller size practice and that end of the spectrum. And just that environment's very different. So 20 years ago or 15 years ago, even the culture environment in practice was very different. And there was a lot more autonomy. There wasn't as much necessity for standardization. And then those individuals who are less concerned about that and more concerned about collegiality or making sure that other individuals are there to help with things that they don't feel comfortable with or perhaps want to exclude from their practice, then they should clearly kind of go on the other end of the spectrum. But what I tell folks is, in addition to just finding a good fit, since we're talking about financial literacy, there's a very big difference between that spectrum on one end and the other. And I think a lot of folks don't realize that. But what drives now here I am 3 years later, what drives patient satisfaction and provider satisfaction and even outcomes to some degree, staff satisfaction, is ultimately market share. And so what I tell folks is don't lose sight of where you are in this industry. We are in an industry that is expanding healthcare, but in a silo that is contracting, right? That's the physician comp silo. And there is economies of scale that you're going to get in a bigger practice that you can't get in a smaller one. And it's a balance. And so sometimes a small practice in an area where you're the only show in town does achieve market share, whereas a small practice in a metropolitan area does not. So what a lot of folks don't realize is the size of your practice really should be taken into context of the market share, particularly from the financial standpoint. You're swimming upstream if you're a small practice in a large metropolitan area. There's just a lot.
I love how you said that. I'm going to use that as our first tagline as you're discussing this. Market share, not necessarily the size of the practice, is the most important factor that will drive your business of your practice, it sounds like, which is really tied and related to the satisfaction you have and the satisfaction your patients have. That's very, very important. So yes, tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think that there's examples where certainly I know them regionally and then of course around the country where some folks hope that their practice, they join a practice, maybe they've chosen the right size, but they hope that they're going to be able to expand it, right? I'm going to change it or I'm going to adjust it. I might bring allergy or I might get CT scanners or I'm going to do balloons or I'm going to do ablations, whatever they happen to be doing or want to be doing. It's really driven by market share. So a lot of times what I notice young otolaryngologists ask is, what do the partners make or what can I do? And even in hospital employed physicians are asking that. What they should be really asking and taking good stock of is, what is the market share currently for the organization that I'm joining, the tax ID number that I'm joining? What is the current market share that this tax ID number has? And what is its potential? Because ultimately that is the coin of the realm. That's the currency. And it will, more so than you can fully appreciate now, drive what you're able to do and the satisfaction across the entire spectrum, from staff to patients to yourself and your family. And so just be mindful of that. I find that the folks that are the most satisfied are ones who've been able to find that right fit in size and personality, but also ones that are kind of in a situation where market share is favorable as opposed to unfavorable in a private practice environment.
Yeah. When we talked about doing this podcast, I'm going to push you even further so that we talk about a subject that honestly, as physicians in training, we go into medicine to make a difference, to take care of patients. And we know that that's the premise we're coming from. But one of the reasons you and I discussed this would be so valuable for our fellow clinicians, our fellow otolaryngologists, is because, as you said it best, you can hide, but you can't run from the financial realities of medical practice. And finding out what is the market share and what is the profit. And yes, we're talking about the word profit because the personal satisfaction and the ability to work well and understand how you're getting paid is so important to then the joy of practicing medicine. It really, over time, becomes tied to it. So I think I'm very glad, and I think you can be even more open about that. And what if I am a young otolaryngologist joining the practice? How do I phrase that question? What do I ask when I'm meeting groups? Because I remember the pressure of meeting at the academy meeting and job interviewing. And I don't know if I'm old as well, and I don't know if that's changed, but you do have limited time. You want to get the information that you need.
Yeah, I think what I would ask and first, what I see, this is what I hear a lot of candidates ask over the years. They'll say, what can I make, or what's my starting salary? What can I make after a few years? What can I make as partner in the private practice world? And they kind of compare that to what they're going to make in a hospital setting if they're considering that as well, a hospital employed setting. That's great. It's a reasonable question to ask. It's an important question to ask. But what I would tell our listeners is that you want to ask, what can I actually generate? And this takes an extra level of thinking, but you can't escape the economic realities of private practice. Nobody can. Market share is so very important, but the reality is a reality. And so the market climate environment are what the market climate environment are. And if you're getting paid $200 for something and you're doing a certain number of unit of that something, if you're getting paid above what you're generating, then you have to be worried about how sustainable that is, because ultimately that will come to roost. Now, you can get some downstream benefit through a hospital, and there's a variety of situations where you'd actually have that be distorted, where your compensation doesn't actually equal the market reality. But you got to be mindful of that. That might not be the place you're going to grow roots and be very successful. That might not be the place where you're able to go ahead and be satisfied, not only in your comp, but quite frankly, in the growth. Everyone wants to see growth. It's natural for all of us to want to see that. That's why we like gardens and when farmers like farming. I mean, we want to see growth.
Blooming flowers.
Yeah, I mean, so I think it's different. Some folks will come into a situation and not ask that question. If somebody is paying you above what you can actually earn in an environment, then you should be skeptical. You should be skeptical. And so there's, particularly if the environment there doesn't support it, right? So I think a lot of folks lose focus on that. And quite frankly, I can think of individuals who have gone from practice to practice. I think we all know folks who have gone from practice to practice, or from hospital practice to then somewhere else. They're always looking for something else, but I think they're kind of forgetting about the market share and the underlying environment. And if the market doesn't support it, you're destined to encounter friction.
I love that. So that's number 2. Number 3 that we spoke about that I think is so valuable, but you may need to define some of these terms. Passive EBITDA beats active EBITDA every day of the week and twice on payday. I'm curious how you'll define this, and I think it is just part of the lingo of financial literacy that we want to introduce on this podcast that everyone should get comfortable with if they're not. But go ahead.
Yeah. So what I found over 2 decades is that some of our listeners might be really focused about on their productivity, what they can do. And even in the last point, we talked about what you can do, how many units you could do, that $200 procedure. But the fact of the matter is that everything we do not only comes with a revenue, but it comes with a profit margin. And so if you're doing a scope, then if you were to cost account for that, you would cost account the capital expense for that scope and any repair costs that are associated with it. And then, of course, some static overhead maybe that you go ahead and account for. And then you're, of course, doing the procedure. And so you come up with whatever that profit margin might be on that procedure based on your average volumes. But if you look at other procedures, you might find that they're more profitable. And I think physicians in general recognize that and will compare. And I think by and large, I think that's why some procedures are very popular in our specialty. But what I think folks forget to compare is in the value of ancillary. So if there is something that is generating revenue ancillary to what you're doing and doesn't require your personal attention, it cost accounts dramatically different. So the profit is much, much higher. And so the more that a practice is able to have its revenue and its profit come from ancillaries, things that don't require the actual physician work product, will magnify.
Dr. Puchalski, what's an ancillary? Give us some examples.
Well, I mean, allergy hearing aids are the classic, I think the two most utilized ancillaries in ENT practice. But then there's many others, right? So physical therapy, vestibular rehab, there's CT scans. Some folks will consider mid-level providers an ancillary, and that's just the way you want to kind of consider that. But certainly extenders can be as well. Sleep medicine, sleep labs, and DME, durable medical equipment, is an ancillary as well that many practices have. And ambulatory surgery center is a wonderful ancillary to have. And so by diversifying a practice or joining a venture that has a diversified ancillary, you can, as long as you participate in those, do far better than you can do otherwise through your own work. And so the important thing is that it's not just revenue. Think about it as earnings, as profit, as EBITDA. These are the things that provide revenue to you, profit to you in the form of a distribution that may or may not be tax advantaged. You'd have to speak to your accountant about that, but could certainly be tax advantaged, and are anything that you're doing more of. And that makes a very big difference in medical practices. And I think that most candidates probably aren't spending enough time getting a good sense for what that is and what the potential there is.
We are talking about things that, let's be honest, are not as sexy as the doing the surgery part. And yet, what I similarly counsel young physicians, young otolaryngologists, when you're joining the practice, it's not just about doing cases in the operating room. Yes, that is exciting. A lot of us, that is why we went into otolaryngology, and taking care of patients in clinic and having that gratification of good medical care. But the reason I wanted you to delineate that is you and I come from the viewpoint where otolaryngeal allergy plays a large role in my practice as well. And my partner has a lot of vestibular rehab, and there's a lot of services, but they're not always sexy. Sometimes it just requires folks spending time with the patient. And I think you pointed out the key. The people spending time with the patients are 99% of the time not me. Freeing me up. That's the passive part. For you otolaryngologists listening to this, whatever frees up your time allows you, even if it's to do the thoughtfulness behind the calculations that you brought up, Bob, on figuring out what does a scope procedure cost me. I work in a very different setting, in a hospital-employed setting within a larger academic center. My hospital is quite community hospital-oriented with a very tough payer mix. And I can tell you that everything that Bob is mentioning around thinking about the financials in a private practice, as you've done, is exactly what I'm being asked in a large health system to get anything approved, bought, or brought into our ENT clinic. So I think the other point you're making, really, the underlying point is it doesn't matter what your practice setting is at this point in 2024. You have to be thinking about these nuances before you go in and over the first year. And perhaps, as you mentioned, it avoids the frustration that many physicians then have around my hospital's not listening or my partners are not listening. It almost has to do with, did you pick the right setting, as you brought up? And second, are you thinking about it from their point of view? Because the folks buying things are definitely thinking about it from everything that you described.
Precisely. I couldn't agree more. I think 20, 30 years ago, there was some difference, and a significant difference, I think, between hospital employment and protection status and research. Those are evaporating and becoming evanescent, and what your economic realities are coming home to roost there as well. And so you just got to be mindful of it. If there's a distortion, be skeptical. Be skeptical just as you would be if you're being paid too little. But when something's not sustainable, it's not sustainable.
So now I want to take an opportunity. We talked a lot with these first 3 points about the practice and as you're setting up and where you should practice and how you can be successful at setting up the ancillaries to significantly increase the types of patients you want to see. But I think our next part of our discussion has to do with how you, as a human being, a physician who wants to practice with joy and also be able to live in mental abundance and financial abundance. And I loved how you were explaining it. Your words, I believe, were, your wealth will be impacted more by living within your means and saving than by producing more than your peers. Find ways to generate passive income in addition outside the practice of medicine. And so let's talk a little bit about that. What are the lessons there? And we all know that we train for a long time. And when we're done training, there is, I know I had it, a little bit of a delayed gratification mentality when we're done our long training of medical school and residency. But again, if you could tell your younger self, what would be those personal lessons around finances that could really help folks out?
Yeah, and I've given this a lot of thought, and I came up with a couple of points, and I've really tried to think about what I've noticed in my peers or in individuals as young otolaryngologists coming on board. But there seems to be some folks who are a little bit more financially independent than others, despite the same amount of hours worked and despite the same hustle, to be honest with you. And so some pitfalls. I do think that naturally we equate self-validation, gratification, worth to how much we do as surgeons. I think that's ingrained in us. I think all of us have it to some extent, and we feel good if we have a busy day. And so if we feel like we need to do better financially, or life throws us a curveball or an extra expense, my observation has been that surgeons will generally look to go ahead and increase their own throughput. And I've seen it from taking more call and pay-for-call contracts or doing more cases or trying to add on a couple more patients a day. And you hear folks talk about work harder or work smarter, not harder. But for the most part, I think people at least apply a little extra work. What I've noticed over the last 2.5 decades is the individuals who are really comparing themselves to their peers or really thinking about it from what they can individually produce tend to just be on the hamster wheel. There's just not a lot of getting ahead. And so we talked a little bit earlier in our conversation about the importance of being able to get that multiplier of ancillaries. Well, I think that there's another dimension of that as well on the personal finance side. And I think one is trying to find ways to get passive income. Well, first and foremost, spending below your means. I think that surgeons who do that have done much better. And surgeons who have tried to compare themselves to their peers or keep up with the Joneses have generally not done well. They are fast forward age 50, and I think they're in a tougher spot. They're more responsive, less independent. And frankly, in some cases, you're really surprised at the situation they might be in, given their status and stature. Those that have spent below, regardless of what that is, do better. So my advice is you're always going to do better if you live below your means, whatever those might be, and you raise capital and you save and you find ways to create passive income with your savings. And it could be as easy as, we're in a luxury situation now, or you can put it in a money market. But I mean, finding a way, something that suits your prowess and your capabilities, whether that be real estate or another business or something else, but don't depend on otolaryngology and medicine. Just like within your practice, don't depend on the things that only you can do. You've got to find force multipliers in the ancillaries. And I think you've got to find ways to go ahead and generate income and comfort outside of medicine.
I love how well you said that and how elegantly you're stating a tough reality, which is spend below your means and then use that savings as your personal capital that then you can, in quotations, invest. And whether you are investing in the market, whether you're investing in real estate, which I learned at the age of 48, not the age of 32. So I think it's been very exciting for me to see that. And I know you have experience in that. And ancillaries within your practice, other things, hobbies, interests that could lead to more. And I'll throw this one in because I think for me personally, and I imagine for you as well, Bob, developing yourself, personal development. There's so many interviews with Warren Buffett on if you had to go back and spend more money on one area, what would it be? And he always answers with something along the lines of investing in your self-education, learning more, developing yourself. Because when we end residency and we start practice, and hopefully we're not, although I have been, on the hamster wheel, so to speak, we tend to keep doing the things we've learned. And if you pause and find a way to grow yourself, I think learn other techniques, work on whether it's self-scheduling, whether it's how you speak, how you present, how you market your practice, where you invest, other things you can do with your money. I think there's a lot of knowledge out there on the internet that is unbelievable that you can do when you are passively generating income instead of seeing 10 more patients in the day during your lunch hour and between the hours of 5 and dinner. So I love that. That was very elegantly stated. Anything else to add to that? Let me play the young otolaryngologist. Bob, I'm in the 2nd or 3rd year of my practice. My partners or my hospital are always meeting with me about RVUs. Where do I even begin to think about that? How would I even look at my spending plan and what that means?
Well, I think you hit the key word, and that's plan. And failing to plan is planning to fail. And I think if there is, the first thing you should do is find out, create a budget. And I think the most important people to have are a good attorney, a good accountant, and a good financial planner. And creating a plan and paying yourself first. So always save every single month, every year. There was always curveballs in life, but creating a plan whereby you save every month and every year, I think, is the critical portion. You will do better with the money that you save than the money you earn from medicine if you follow that prescription for 25 years, even 20 years. I mean, you will. There's just no question. You'll make more off the money you save than the practice of medicine. And as you find other things, just speaking to wellness, because I think it's so important you brought that up, is that, I mean, you'll find yourself to be more multidimensional, less unidimensional. You'll create a little bit of a cushion from burnout and stress. You'll find other sources of validation and identity. There'll be less imposter syndrome going on. I think there's a lot of benefit from being able to do that. But you're all of a sudden in a creative environment instead of an environment where it's, hey, I'm saving for retirement through my 401k, but there's no real path toward anything else. And so I would tell you as a new person to get a good plan, get a good budget put together and follow it and save every single month and every single year. If you can get a third of your comp saved, it's a game changer. And not easy, but make those decisions up front. Limit those expenses, purchase your cars and your homes accordingly. Do it based on the reality in the context of savings, as opposed to what you think you should have or what somebody else has or what your partner has or what another physician or another professional has.
I love there were a few takeaways you had. And as I have been really delving into this world and personally am on this mission that otolaryngologists and medical professionals, we don't often get this training. I mean, I don't know if they do it now in residency, but I certainly didn't. There's a few pearls that you gave that I think you would be surprised how many people don't have. One is an accountant. There are many, many physicians I know, otolaryngologists in fact, who used to be like me and do our own taxes, quote unquote. They're pretty simple. Maybe I consult someone, but I don't want to pay them too much. So it's a quick consultation. So I think having an accountant, having an attorney, the first few employments I had, I didn't have an employment attorney to really help and guide me. And I think that's really important that you brought up. Having a tax strategist to help, not just what Bob you're saying around doing your taxes, but actually more around all of this money that I'm saving. And let me point out the fabulous percentage that you just said. Not 2%, not 3%, about 33%. If you start and you manage to find a way to save a third of your money, that's a high bar. That's a high bar. But if folks manage to do that, just compounding that across the board with diversified ways to make smart investments, that's a long way 20 years from now, 10 years from now, honestly, even 5 years from now, from feeling like I don't have to keep working because I need the income. I will then be working because I love what I do as an otolaryngologist. So I think those are pearls that may seem that folks know, but I think it's the stuff that we don't often learn because we're busy learning so much on how to take care of patients. So that brings me to kind of a final point in the discussion, which is treat capital like the scarce resource it is. That was such a beautiful statement. And do that both in business and personal finances. What does that mean? And bear in mind, I work for a big hospital, right? And when you wrote this, I think about our larger capital as well because it impacts me. But I don't think I used to think that way. So tell us what you mean by that statement and how we can put that practically into effect starting next week, starting tomorrow.
Yeah, so I see some pitfalls that some of our colleagues might get into. The first is personal debt. I think that we all have to start out with personal debt. You're going to buy your first home, a starter home, unless you have help. You're going to have to do that with debt. And you probably did, others do it. And I think it's a reasonable thing to do. I think folks will keep doing it though. And you see that with a boat and with a car and with a second home. And personal debt is something that everyone should be working to eliminate. It should not be something that you accumulate with age. It should be something that you work toward removing. On the business side, it's different, at least in my viewpoint. I think a business entity, particularly in a non-recourse environment, regardless of what you're doing in another business or real estate venture, debt's an important ingredient in what makes a very good dish. And it should be managed and not avoided. But on the personal side, I unfortunately see a lot of our colleagues get a little overzealous. And so it's almost the opposite of savings. So if we're talking about trying to find some sort of freedom and the validation that it comes from, and even the mentality, the state of mind that you have from knowing you're accumulating and that you're building towards something, debt is the opposite of that, right? So it's dragging you down. It's taking a portion of your earnings and putting it toward interest, essentially, right? And so I think some folks get into a little bit of trouble there. And so create your capital, avoid debt on the personal side. And when you have your capital, treat it like it is the most scarce resource you have. It is. Ultimately, it represents your stored work, right? And so don't squander it. And so I do see a lot of folks who will do one of two things. They'll either go long, and they don't need to. If you're saving, you can go and swing for singles and doubles all day long. You'll win the game. You don't need to go for the fences. But there's a lot of folks going for the fences on the latest, greatest idea or what have you. And they're forgetting about diversification and a variety of other very important fundamental investment principles. And so I would avoid that. And the other thing that seems to happen is the country club money. It seems as though, I call it that, but
that's a good euphemism.
When somebody comes over and says, "Hey, I'm investing I got this great investment. If everybody can go ahead and $20,000 a piece or $100,000 a piece, and let's go ahead and do this venture." And so I've adopted a principle, and I've learned this the hard way, but I've adopted a principle where we don't invest in anything that's got a personal relationship. So if it's somebody who's a friend or a neighbor or what have you, regardless of how good it is, and I'm okay, I'll accept the fact that you might miss a home run or two, but we don't do that at all. So my advice is to treat capital like the scarce resource it is, and really avoid the home runs, really avoid applying it outside of what is a holistic strategic plan. If someone's coming to you, it might not be part of your strategic plan. I mean, it might be something that's worthwhile, but you really should be always taken into context of what you're trying to accomplish. So that's my advice.
Which then predicates back to you need a strategic plan. And what I've learned in the recent past through some coursework is a life plan is very important, and a life strategic plan is very important. So I feel like we've given our audience a lot of cautionary and great information. And I want to uplift everyone at the end of this podcast and say, okay, you heard some of what to do looking into how you find a job and really look at the market share and really think about it. And you've thought about how you're going to look at ancillaries and passively generate revenue at your practice. But then you're also going to look at how you're going to passively generate revenue personally in something that you're interested in, which is then part of your strategic plan. But now let's say that folks are doing that. What can you expect to see starting to put this in action? And the final one that you said that's so key is pay yourself first. I think that's the biggest takeaway. Pay yourself first doesn't mean buy yourself the next most expensive thing that you want. Maybe that's part of your plan, but it does mean you're proportioning a percentage of your income that you decide up front and say, I'm going to use this as the capital I'm going to invest. Let's say, Bob, that I start doing this today and I'm a few years into practice or I'm 20 years into practice. What can you expect to see in the next year, in the next 5 years, and in the next 10 years? What made you feel, okay, this is on the right trajectory for myself and my family?
Yeah, for me personally, the goal was recognizing that there's 2 physicians in the family and we've got 4 children, that there were going to be a lot of other demands and that we might not be able to practice forever. And so recognizing that we're selling a service, that's what we do as physicians, and that service isn't always going to be readily available or limited in some way, whether it be eyesight or dexterity or, God forbid, mental acuity. My dad's got some dementia. And so speaking just personally, there's some challenges there. We all see them in our patients every day. So your strategy should be one where you can find a way that earn enough from your savings to eclipse what you earn as a physician, stated as plainly as it can be. And I think that a lot of folks are really ingrained in saving for retirement and getting to a certain point. What do I need? What's the number that I need to go ahead and retire? I would tell you that it's not that number as much as it's cash flow, right? I mean, that's what you feel on a month-to-month basis, on a day-to-day basis. Folks feel wealthy when they feel flush with cash, right? It's cash flow. People may erroneously spend because of the wealth effect, but really it's what you have coming in. And so a personal goal has always been to focus on that. And I think that our listeners should focus on that. I mean, there's going to be a time where you're not as spry as you are now. You will not be able to take a call all night and go in and operate the next day. As a 52-year-old, it's just not going to keep happening. You're not going to be able to do it. And as a consequence, you should recognize that and you should plan accordingly. But I think you're better off planning for something that's more cash flow centric than just a number in terms of capital or savings.
That's beautiful. I like that. Well said. Should a family member get sick, something happened to you, God forbid, I have friends, a child got sick. Are you able to just take a break or not have to work and still pay your bills and be okay for a little bit? And it isn't 2 months or 3 months. What's that longer term sustainability on that? I think that's really important. I think the other point, and it's funny, we were not planning to integrate the wellness as much as we are, but it also gives a sense of security and well-being to know if I get tired, if I need a break, if I have that comfort, that security, that if I'm not able to do something, my family will be provided for. I think that is something that doesn't just have to happen at that sort of discrete time when you quote unquote retire. Because the other thing we surgeons are famous for is not necessarily rushing to retire. In fact, many of us love what we do and want to keep working. But it doesn't mean, as you're saying, that we have to financially feel we have to keep working. Those are very different.
I hope to continue to take care of patients until I'm not able to physically for one reason or the other. But it's a very different state of mind when you're not having to do it and when you're doing it voluntarily and proactively and rather than with no options.
I love that. So I think you've answered all the topics I wanted to cover. And I think one of the amazing things about BackTable is just the variety, right, of podcasts. And the thought here was to provide maybe the first in a series of really practical topics. And I thought the topic we came up with, financial literacy, is so important because knowing that terminology and getting kind of a feel and a deeper understanding. And I think what you said, Bob, about getting help with the right people, whether it's business help, whether it's personal help, whether it's an accountant, whether it's an attorney, whatever help, we don't have to know it all. There's people out there that can help us navigate this with I will admit, from my standpoint, a very high degree of skepticism as well, because you have to be careful. People do know that we generate revenue and they may want to take advantage. So I think the more our listeners can follow what you've stated, Bob, and understanding how much revenue you generate and where it's coming from and what the profit capabilities might be in your practice and in your personal finances and how you can sort of invest that personal capital, the better understanding you have of the actual numbers, the less likely you're going to end up in a difficult situation.
Precisely.
Any last thoughts, words of inspiration for our listeners?
Yeah, I would just like to end it on a positive note. We are in a absolutely privileged position to be physicians. We are in a situation where we get paid for a service very well, comparatively, and we are able to do work that is extremely validating and helps other individuals. You can get too much of a good thing, and you've got to watch out for it. But we also just want to end on a positive one that you're going to do very well. The potential here in our specialty is really fabulous. So not only in our profession, but also otolaryngology within our specialty is really fabulous, as long as you just don't find yourself in one of these pitfalls. And so approach it as you would just hitting singles and doubles. And you will find that is plenty to do very well in your life and to be able to accomplish goals that are far beyond anything in healthcare or being a physician.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love it. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you today.
Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, rate the podcast 5 stars, and share with a friend. If you have any questions or comments, direct message us at BackTable ENT on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter. BackTable ENT is hosted by Gopi Shah
and Ashley Agan.
Our audio team is led by Kieran Gannon, with support from
Aaron Bowles,
Josh McWhirter,
and Josh Spencer.
Design and digital marketing led by Brian Schmitz, with support from
Taylor Spurgeon Hess.
Social media and PR by Chi Ding.
Administrative support provided by Judy Dela Cruz. Thanks again for listening and see you next week.